Here are 3 acorns, all made out of oak, 2 of them with pyrograph caps, and the top one's got a tube kit. 3 other ideas. A castle key fob, which was made for a hotel. I'll start with making the acorns. So I'm using small jaws. I'm just clamping onto square section wood. I need a adapter for the thread on my lathe, which is why it's so far out from the headstock. No great finesse in setting it up. I'm just going to tap it so that it centres at the tailstock end. Tighten the tailstock a little. Tighten up the chuck, which is very important if you're fastening onto square section. And I'm just going to rough this down. Even though it's a small piece, I still use my normal roughing gouge, which is a large 1¼ inch diameter Henry Taylor, which I've got used to using and use for almost all spindle work. Just about there now. Probably a bit more attentive than I need to be, but that's the style. And now I'm going to shape this into an acorn. I'm using a 1/2 inch spindle gouge, Henry Taylor again. Probably my most used tool. As you'll probably see on some shots, there's only about 1 inch of flute left, so that's due for renewal. Apologies for the burnout on the video. I haven't quite mastered the art of getting the auto focus and the auto exposure correct for turning. It's not like this in all the videos, it's just the beginning. Just making a slight nib at the end of the acorn, which I like to see. The acorn's probably not a realistic acorn shape. I've made a lot of these little key rings and it's quite interesting to try and get the perfect shape. But I think a real acorn is not as pointed as what I tend to make, and I like the slight point and taper, as you can see here. So a little bit of sanding, starting with 120. Do a bit of fading through the different grits, but we're going up through 180, 240, 320, and then it's going to shape the end onto a little stalk, such as an acorn would have. Now it's got two advantages in having a stalk. One is I can drill through it and make a hole for the keyring to fit in, and the other is I don't need to part off the acorn and hold it. And then just a little bit of smoothing off here. And then I'm going to cut it off, which I tend to do rather than parting off. Just using a Japanese handsaw. Now, having made this, despite having lots of offcuts in my garage, I can't resist the temptation to try and use this tiny little stub here rather than throw it away. So, if possible, I'm going to just make a small stubby acorn. It's amazing really how I hate to throw wood away, even though it's so tiny and I've plenty of other pieces to be working on. I suppose it's a challenge really, and also being a Yorkshireman. It's a little bit difficult when it comes to turning this side of the acorn, working really close to metal spinning at about 2000 RPM, and the jaws, because they're fastened onto square sections, are if you catch your finger on them you would know about it. Now we're going to have a go at a 2-inch larger acorn based around a brass tube kit. I think these look a lot nicer and much sturdier, and the 2-inch size, if you think about keys that you have for sheds and front doors and back doors, you want a decent size because you don't want to lose it. I've stopped using the brass fastener for tubes, and instead I use one of these mandrels that locate onto the mandrel and put friction on the end of the tube. Again, up to about 2000 RPM, and still using the big roughing gouge despite it being a small piece of wood. Now there is a mistake that I've made here. You might be able to spot it what it is, but I do correct it later on. You'll see the problem developing as I begin to shape the piece. So I've got it to round back to the spindle gouge. I realised first of all I need to just take the ends off because the tube is slightly shorter than the piece of wood. So this is squaring up the ends to the end of the tube. A little bit tricky there with the corn on the end of the mandrel. Here we go, just rolling over the spindle gouge. And once again, I'm probably working slower than a true professional would. Bit of shear scraping is a very good way of shaping this kind of small object. So by shear scraping I mean working on the lower side of the blade. And already you begin to see the acorn take shape. I like to have a cap in a ratio of maybe 1 to 2, 1/3 of the way down. I like a small chamfer there rather than a sharp step. So shear scraping again to get the bottom of the acorn. Can't get in there, so I'm going to use a very fine 1/8 parting chisel. Actually beginning to see the mistake I've made here in mounting the acorn. Might have just noticed it catching there, so brought up the tailstock a little bit more to increase the friction. Yet more shear scraping, but still can't quite get into the end as I want to. So trying with the thin parting chisel again. And then I eventually realised what I've forgotten, and that is I should really have put some bushings to space you see there's still a little bit left to take away on the end there. So now this will give me a much better access to the ends. Simply I haven't made one of these for quite some time, and I've forgotten the best way to do it. But now I can get into there with my favourite spindle gouge, shear scrape away and make sure that I get to the bottom of the tube. Once again fiddling about, perhaps more than I would need to. Usually make these in batches of 10 or 20 at a time, and after the first one you get quite a lot quicker as you go along. go. Shapes. Just going to go through the bits here. Start at 120, 180, up to 320. I think is enough. Just finish off the ends a little. So for the small acorn, still a hole through the stub there to take the keyring. And you can see on the bench, that's the tiny little stub that was left that I managed to get another acorn out of. Probably saved me about 2p in wood. And then I like to pyrograph the cap or cup, and the burning, it's one of the few times I use the pyrography kit on a high temperature, because I want to burn into the wood and leave some definite holes, and I also want to burn around the hole to create the darker brown. It's quite difficult to try and be random and make sure that none of the dots line up. And also the nib I'm using here, it's actually a spoon nib. Try to make sure it doesn't leave rectangular holes rather than round holes. This is speeded up 20 times. Normally the pyrography takes as long as the turning, and for a 2-inch version of this the pyrography probably takes longer. It's quite a relaxing thing to do. I don't think it would be a commercially viable operation. There we go. Have a look at some other examples. This one's made from some spalted oak, so I didn't feel it needed any decoration to the cup. Here's one with no decoration at all. The only advantage is you can sell them a bit cheaper because they've taken less time. You can see the keyring through the stud there. Just push that down, yeah. Here's one with the keyring chain fastened to a hook, and there's the keyring on the tube. You can make smaller acorns just by cutting the tube down and still using the tube kit. That was made as a joke for somebody, and that's a logo for UPM, a forestry company. So the next keyring's made in 2 parts. This is a piece of African blackwood, and this is a piece of sycamore. I'm just roughing the ends to give it a better grip when I put the adhesive on. I'm going to use ordinary PVA wood glue, and this is Gorilla wood glue, which I've found to be very successful. Just taking out a little bit of shaving there. I don't bother gluing both sides, just don't think it's necessary with this. But I do make sure the glue's evenly spread. clamp them together, I like to use clamps that you can screw and get a good amount of pressure on. So a G-clamp will work well here. The hand clamps are good and quick, but you know, the one-handed clamps, they don't allow you to give a really tight pressure. It's a bit fiddly because of the amount of glue I put on makes the surfaces slide. But it doesn't matter about getting glue everywhere because it's all going to be turned off. And once that's lined up appropriately, I like to leave it for overnight before moving on to the next step, which is to drill a 7mm hole for the tube in the tube kit, the keyring kit. I'm holding the piece holding the tube in a handy little tapered handle which just allows you to hold it while you're putting glue on and fixing it in place. Just going to use super glue. It's a thick version. Spread it on quite liberally and then push it through the hole there. And then I think I just need to put my thumb on to keep it in place as the applicator comes out. Okay, and again I like to leave those overnight so that the glue sets. I know it's supposed to be fast setting, but I've found sometimes if I turn them too soon the tube separates from the wood. Always remember to take the glue off the applicator, otherwise it gets rather jammed up. So once that's dried overnight, the next step is to use a little mill, and this does two things. It cleans up the end, but it also squares it up so that the two ends are square. I'm holding the piece in a bench vise with two little divots in it, so I can hold it corner to corner, which tends to keep it vertical. And then we go down until the pressure changes and you can feel that you've touched the tube. You can also sometimes just see a little bit of brass shaving as it hits the top of the tube. There we go. And if the tube's nice and shiny, it means that we've hit it and squared it off. The same on the other side. Pushing down until I feel the resistance from the tube. If you shave a bit too much off the brass tube, it doesn't matter on a keyring. If you were doing a pen, obviously, you'd change the length of the tube, and that might mean that the pen insert didn't quite fit. But there's a lot more give and take on a keyring. So now it's mounted on the pen mandrel. I've remembered the bushings this time. Just adjusting the length of the mandrel. Bring up the tailstock with the it's actually a live centre at the end, which applies the pressure, and go through the usual process. First of all, turning it to round with my roughing gouge, working about 2000 RPM. Not a lot to say about this. Probably do it a bit quicker as always, but I'm a hobbyist rather than a professional. Still a little bit of flat to get rid of there. Finally remembered to put my visor on, which I should have done at the beginning. Even though it's a small piece, it's always better to be safe. I'm making sure that I get rid of the white join here. The white is going to turn into a face and the black will turn into a top hat. I don't want any white showing underneath the top hat. Just remember that I need to square off the ends, get rid of the slight recess. Probably slightly blunted my chisel there and hitting the spacer. So those are squared off. Now I can do the shaping. And the spindle gouge. Just rolling the gouge round. Get a bit closer. Shear scraping to smooth the surface off, and then the top hat, a little brim. Some people like the top hat to have a curve or certainly an angle. It's all a matter of choice, and it's all perhaps a matter of what the chisel does. Sometimes I leave a little band on the hat, which I've thought about here, but then I think eventually I take it away. I don't like the hat to be flat at the top, so I'm just shear scraping to round it off ever so slightly. Try and avoid flat shapes on turning, flat sides. If I can. Then go through the grits. I tend to use separate paper for the black and the white wood, because otherwise the African black wood would get into the grain of sycamore. Well, there you can see the black wood is dark brown rather than black. So on to some pyrography. Very simple. He's going to get two eyes. Just turn up the machine a little. So I want to burn the eyes right in deep. And then we want a smiley face, which again is going to dig in deep. As always, it could be quicker, but that's not the way I work. Then a bit of sanding sealer. This is cellulose sanding sealer. Just apply it all round, using the applicator to try and stop it getting on my fingers. Now, I had a little offcut when I cut the block of sycamore, and as always, what do you do with offcuts? Well, try not to throw them away. So I've cut this into a smaller section. I'm going to mount it in some pin jaws and make a little nose for the top hat man. Again, running around 2000 RPM. I keep a set of small spanners which I use instead of calipers for sizing little pegs or dowels. So this is a 4mm spanner, and I'm just turning a little peg on the end of this chap's nose, and then I can drill a 4mm hole and know that it will fit. There we go. A tiny little step there they want to just take away. That's it. Obviously the nose could be any shape, but this is more or less spherical. Again, I prefer to cut them off rather than part them off. Sometimes parting off splinters the end of the wood. This won't make too much, little man. There we go. That's a 4mm hole. Just check that it fits. There he is. Bit of super glue into the hole. Then wipe his nose. And then onto the buffing machine. So mine's a dual 3-wheel buffing machine. It's actually an old lathe which is set up almost permanently as a buffing machine. In the first wheel I'm using triply wax, which is abrasive, and that means you need to try and stay away from the brass tube because it will react with the brass and turn the wheel black. And it would also then put black marks onto the wood if you transferred it across. So all kinds of angles, trying to get a bit of wax on every part of the keyring apart from the brass. Triply wax finished. Second wheel. This one's for white diamond, which is still abrasive but less so than the triply. That's more than enough, just a single brush of it. If you put too much on, you tend to get a white residue on any grain that's there, which I don't want on a black hat. So the third wheel is the finishing wheel, and that's going to have some carnauba wax on. Much softer. And this creates a high sheen polish, good hard wearing finishing wax. Should be him finished. Now you can assemble keyring kits on the lathe, just use the lathe as a press, but I happen to have a pen press. I think somebody bought me, so I'll finish him on there. Just a little pressure, and that's the stud in the bottom. Turn it round. I'm just putting a piece of wood there, otherwise the stud, which is already in place, can bite into the nylon stock that's already there. There we go. Tiny bit of pressure. And he's got his top and bottom studs in, and finish off by putting the keyring in place. It's a split ring. And there he is, the keyring. There's some variations on a theme. You see the middle one's got a little black band. There's one with just a hat, and again you can see the black band there. So next up, this is a piece of cedar. I have lots of offcuts of cedar from making summer house finials. And I haven't really thought of what to do with them. Cedar is a very soft wood and it's very light. But I thought I would make a cone. Now, it's not going to be a cedar cone, although I think I will have a go at one of those at some point. Out on my travels, I quite often go looking around wood. This is a sequoia cone, which is a giant redwood. This is going to end up slightly smaller than the cone itself, but as with all these things, the actual sizes and shapes are variable because they are in nature. Nothing very ambitious about this shape, it's just going to be a cone shape, an egg shape. Once again I'm going to leave a little stalk at the end, which I can drill and put I might actually cut this one off without a stalk. Let's see what I do. A bit of shear scraping to refine the shape. And again through the grit, starting at 120. And going up to 320, I think. Now that I've done the sanding, I can make the stalk a little thinner. And there we go. I haven't actually cut it off yet, which gives me something to hold while I'm doing some pyrography. I probably didn't need to map this out with a pencil, but it's easier to rub pencil out than it is to get rid of pyrography, so just getting a rough pattern on here. Seeing how it works on the original. And once again, I'm using the pyrography kit on a high temperature, so you can see the smoke. So it's quite unusual for me. I normally only work at 2 or 3 when I'm doing detailed pyrography. But here I actually want to burn into the wood and create a deep groove to mimic the pine cone or sequoia cone. Just speeding it up 20 times. and then filling in the diamonds that are created. And there we go, there's the finished pyrographed version. So just use a brad awl to make a little hole, and then an eye screwed in. This has been sealed and waxed, by the way. Then there's a tiny little split ring that fits on to a key and chain. And this is in antique brass, I think. Quite fiddly. Just close up the split ring. There we go. And we've got a cone keyring. Having done all that pyrography, it does make me think, well, is it any better than the original article? So I put a bit of sealer on that as well, and turn that into a keyring using the same method. There we go. A pyrographed sequoia cone and a real sequoia cone. Now these are key fobs, quite large, and they were made for a hotel who wanted 25 of them, one for each room. So I've mounted this on a screw chuck into the 7mm hole. It's got a tube for it, this one, or it will have. But on this keyring, I'm actually turning between centres rather than using a mandrel. And that will allow me to do the details on each end, which would be difficult on a mandrel. I'm just making a little chucking point on one end to give me a better hold than the screw chuck. So replacing the screw chuck with a small, I think this is an RS2000, a record small chuck. And the first thing to do is to try and get some dimensions in here, so I squared off the end. As always with me, probably more attention to detail than is needed. Just getting it a little bit squarer, getting rid of the square parts. So here's a template that I have. It's actually a piece that I made and then broke one of the castellations, so I've kept it as a template. So I've got 3 sections which are important to get the width right, and when I made a batch of 25 I found it was very useful to have different calipers set for each key width. So I had my 3 calipers and actually wrote on top, middle and bottom. And then I would just size the top here. And then underneath the castellation at the top there's a small bead which has a slightly different thickness. Just measuring it against the template. And then turning this down to that measurement. And then there's another bead near the bottom. Again turning that using a different set of calipers. And the very first prototype I made for these key rings, I left the bottom flat, but that meant that it wouldn't stand up once we put the little key ring nib at the end. So I made a slight adaptation to the design and hollowed out the base. And this is why I haven't put a tube in yet, and I'm not turning it on a mandrel, because I wanted this little hollow here, so that when I put the keyring kit in, it will still stand upright. Just making sure that there's a slight taper on the base so that it will stand on the rim. Sand and finish that off. Might notice a slight crack in the wood there. Most of that disappears once I turn the shape. Now I'm turning away the stock in between where the beads will be, knowing that those are the right dimensions. None of this is important if you're just making one of these, but making 25, you really want them to look as close as possible to being the same. I'm using a beading chisel here, Ashley Isles, 6mm I think, rocking it from side to side to create the bead. And once that's there, go back to the spindle gouge and take the surfaces either side of the bead to blend them in. There's a slight taper from the left hand bead to the right hand, and there's a bigger taper here. It's quite important that it looks like the line here runs through the bead. And then put one more bead on the face. And wobbling it from side to side. And then tapering it away down to the second bead. It's slightly too high on this side, so making sure that the line runs through the bead. Now I'm just using a point tool to create a small groove and also to define those beads ever so slightly, make them nice and sharp. Sanding, just race through. Now I made a mistake here in doing this one off. I should have put a chucking point, or a chucking ring really, round the base so that I could remount the piece on the chuck, but I forgot. So I'm having to remount it on the screw chuck, which isn't really stable and strong enough, and is probably going to lead to a little bit of off-centre wobble on this. Bring the tailstock up to try and centre it as much as possible, But I can remember when making the whole batch of 25, I left a small ring step on the base, which allowed me to put it into a chuck. So here's the moment of truth. Yeah, you can see there, it's just not quite centered perfectly. But I'm going to live with it. Now this time I am going to part this off, because there's already a 7mm hole in the centre. And I'm going to take away the end once I've parted it off. There we go. Now I need to hollow out the end to get the top of the castle. Just marking where I want the castellations to go down to. And my lathe has got a 24-point indexer built in. So what I'm doing here is moving it one index, then 1, 2, 3 notches. Put a mark, then 1 notch, then 3 notches, 2, 3, mark. The indexer has got numbers, so I could look at them and go 1, 2, 5, 6 and so on, but they're in a very tiny window on the end of the headstock, not particularly easy to read. So just clicking the notches seems to work. Now I'm using a proxon with a small circular saw on to cut away the castellations. And I'm just resting the proxon on the tool rest, try and give me a bit of stability. Locking the lathe at each point here. So a fairly delicate operation, but I found I could get a reasonably accurate result. I had tried a jigsaw and I had tried sort of miniature router bits and things, but this seemed to be the best solution. Again, you can see that slight wobble there, which isn't ideal, but I should have left that chucking point on. Okay, so that's just cleaning up the inside, taking the inside down to the bottom of the grooves. Get rid of the slight burring on the outside. And as best I can on the inside. And then I need to work around each of the castellation grooves. Could use a tiny file, but I'm just going to use sandpaper. So get rid of the slight burning in some of them and also square them off. Just put a small metal rule in there to give it a bit more, make it a bit more square and solid to get into the corners. Tiny bit more cleaning up and that's that. Then put a tube in. Now this is you can buy 12-inch long tubes rather than the standard 2-inch pen tubes. I'm just marking off the length so that I can cut it to size. Put a rod inside the tube so that when I squeeze it in the vise I don't distort the tube. And then cut it off with a hacksaw. I think I'd put the rod a little too far in there, so I was cutting through the rod as well as the tube and just adjusted it. There we go. Use that applicator again to even out the circle at the end, and then I'm going to use my Pro Edge to square off the tube and get rid of any swarf there. Just check it's the right size. If it isn't, then you can take any dimension off with the Pro Edge as suitable. These long tubes come ready scuffed up to give them a bit more adhesion. So a bit of thick super glue. Twirl it round. It's in place. And as always, I would leave that overnight before I did anything else with it. Put the kit on. Seal it and wax it after having put any names that might be on. So there's the 25 that I made. Each one's got a different room name on. They all stand up. And then the hotel liked them and wanted another 25 as spares. The final keyring project is to make a cricket ball. So this is a 2-inch square block of paddock, which is the closest wood I can think of to red without using any stain. I'm just milling the ends to get them square and to bring them to the right size. Again, holding it in the bench vise on the corners, which helps to keep it vertical. Mounted on the mandrel, bushings in place. Start with the boring bit, just simply getting it turned to round. It looks like it's turning slowly, but that's just a trick of the flickering light. It's running about 2000 RPM. Square off the end with a parting chisel to find the end of the glass tube. Tiny little bit more rounding off, and then you could use a sphere jig here, particularly if you were doing a large batch. That might be sensible. I tend to just do them by eye, partly because I like the challenge and partly because I can't be bothered setting up the sphere jig for a one-off as I'm doing here. I'm just rounding this off with spindle gouge, half-inch spindle gouge, step back with a shave scraping. That centre line's useful in trying to keep it symmetrical. There's also a method of turning spheres using octagonal measurements, but again you can measure it all out, or you can do as I do and work by eye. Now at this point I've brought in the extractor fan because the paddock dust is not good. It's very unpleasant. So I'm going to try and get rid of as much as I can. I use a small quarter circle. I have a lot of bits cut for different size spheres, and then I just use those to test every now and again whether I've got the right curve. Shear scraping round. Check with a little template. There's not much room for error on this because I want a 2-inch sphere and it needs to match the ends of the tube, the 2-inch tube that I've put through the centre. Because I'm nearly there, I can afford to take off the centre mark guideline. Another check to see if it's looking spherical. Down to very small adjustments now. Which are all done using shear scraping on the bottom edge of the gouge. As always, I'm probably being more particular than I should be and working slower than, well, certainly slower than a professional would. But my life doesn't depend on it. Now, a cricket ball has a seam. I'm just going to put some small grooves using a point tool back in the centre there. And then I'm using a texturing tool. It's a small ball, a Henry Taylor decorating elf, just to create an effect of stitching on either side of those grooves. But you'll see it better later once I've stopped the lathe. Still not too clear, but it will become clearer on later pictures. Now I'm going to put a groove on each side of those stitches to define them. Now I need to take a little bit of the sphere away to make the seam stand out a little bit. All this is to give an effect rather than to be an exact copy of a cricket ball seam. As long as it looks like it's a seam on a ball, that's good enough. Just creating a tiny step there down from the seam to the sphere. Now, because paddock is so horrible dust, I've put my respirator mask on when I'm going through the grits, and I've got the extractor nearby. Working up to 320 or 400 I think in this one. There we go. We put some cellulose sanding sealer on, and you can see immediately that brings out the red colour which I'm after to imitate the cricket ball. Make quite a lot of cricket trophies, which are 3 wickets and a cricket ball hitting them. I make the wickets out of ash as they would be, and the cricket ball out of paddock. You can maybe just see the texture in there. Always worth rubbing in the sanding sealer, because otherwise you can get some blotches in it when it comes to polishing. So there we go, it's rubbed in, and it also dries it a little quicker. I'll take that off the lathe. Finish off with some polish, triply wax to start. I think I've probably put the tube in, so yes, I have got to put the tube in. So just trying to avoid the ends of the brass tube to stop blackening my wheel. Second wheel, white diamond. Quick rub over, doesn't need any more. No. And then finish off with carnauba wax. So I need to change the wheel again. Never mix up your waxes and your wheels. Keep one wheel for one wax. So this is the carnauba wax finish. And there's the finished article with its ring in place. Now there is an Australian version which comes with a piece of abrasive.